What really happened when a kamikaze pilot survived their final flight? The truth is darker, stranger, and way more human than the myth. So let's dive right in.
20-year-old Takehiko Ino was prepared to die. It was April 28, 1945, and he was making the final preparations for his first mission as a pilot in the Japanese Army, a mission that was designed to be his last. Once he took off, there would be no turning back. He had been trained to suppress his emotions and convinced to die for the honor of his country. He and his fellow kamikaze pilots had been ordered not to return. Instead, they were embarking on a one-way mission that would only end when they had crashed their planes into the side of an American battleship in a suicidal mission that he had been told would bring honor to his family and glory to him. And yet the young student couldn't help but wonder, what if a kamikaze pilot survived?
That what if is wild, like glitching the Matrix. A kamikaze who survives, that flips the whole propaganda machine on its head. You're trained to see survival as dishonor, but biology doesn't care about slogans. Imagine landing in enemy territory suddenly a POW and realizing the Empire's heroic narrative doesn't apply anymore. It's almost like rage quitting a video game and respawning where you weren't supposed to. My guess, he was probably avoided from society after this.
By 1944, after nearly 5 years of brutal and bloody warfare across Europe, World War II had started to turn to the favor of the Allies in the European theater. After the D-Day invasion, they had repelled the Nazis from France in the west, and with the help of the Russians, the Allies were giving them hell on the Eastern Front too. It seemed like only a matter of time before the Nazis surrendered, but the war was not yet over for the Allies, particularly for the US, who had entered the war late and would go on to fight countless battles against the Japanese long after the war in Europe was over. The US had tried to stay out of the war, but Japan had forced their hand when on December 7, 1941, they launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, prompting the US to enter the war in full force. Some of the bloodiest battles of the entire war would take place in the seas and sky of the Pacific Theater in the final years of the war, as the US turned their attention to making Japan pay for Pearl Harbor. Facing the full might of the US military machine, the desperate Japanese needed a new way to fight the Americans, and so the legendary kamikaze was born.
Kamikaze as new strategy was really a last-ditch UX patch for a collapsing empire. Optimize morale, ignore logistics. Desperation meets Bushido cosplay. Weaponize honor when you can't outbuild Detroit. It's grimly modern, like turning users into the product, human drones before drones. And the irony? The tactic telegraphed Japan's strategic bankruptcy, accelerating US resolve. Think about this. When a state's plan requires your death to work, the war and the narrative are already lost.
The word kamikaze means divine wind, a reference to a fabled moment in ancient Japanese history when an unexpected typhoon saved Japan from a horde of Mongol invaders in 1281. The US, though, had another name for these fanatical fighters. They called them baka bombs, from the Japanese word baka, which means idiot. Since the kamikaze planes were relatively easy to shoot down as they barreled directly toward the US ships, the US military couldn't wrap their minds around what would drive so many young Japanese men to sacrifice their lives in such a spectacular and final way. Still, the kamikaze were able to inflict some serious damage on the US and her allies. Though only about 1 in 5 kamikaze pilots managed to hit their targets, they succeeded in sinking 34 ships and damaging hundreds of others over the final years of the war. During the fierce Battle of Okinawa alone, kamikaze pilots were responsible for the deaths of 5,000 US Navy seamen, the greatest loss of life in a single battle in the history of the US Navy. The kamikaze tactics were also an effective form of psychological warfare. Every kamikaze mission was a suicide mission, and none of the thousands of kamikaze pilots who took to the air at the end of World War II were expected to return from their first and final flight. The US and her allies could not believe that so many young Japanese men were willing to take such drastic actions to defeat their enemies, and they lived in constant fear of the next desperate kamikaze attack. History remembers the kamikaze as fanatics who were honored to die for their emperor and their country, but those who survived tell a somewhat different story. In writing his 2008 book on the kamikaze, Danger's Hour, author Maxwell Taylor Kennedy had expected to find a story of fanaticism and fervent ideology among the kamikaze, but he was surprised by what his research uncovered. He found that the kamikaze were not unlike their American counterparts in their patriotism and self-sacrifice, calling them extraordinarily patriotic, but at the same time, extraordinarily idealistic.
That twist that survivors spoke of idealism, not blind zeal, is huge. The divine wind was propaganda, but behind it were teenagers pushed into duty with poetry and pressure. Kennedy's research shows less cult, more weaponized youth. Modern Echo, narratives online that turn people into disposable content. And honestly, the fear factor worked. Not the crashes themselves, but the uncertainty. You can armor steel, not a sailor's imagination.
By design, kamikaze pilots were not intended to survive their first and only mission. And yet most of what we know about the kamikaze comes from those who survived and lived to tell their stories. So what happened if a kamikaze pilot survived? Some, like Hisao Horiyama, never had the chance to fulfill their glorious final mission and lived to share the real story of what drove thousands of kamikaze pilots to undertake their suicidal missions. Horiyama was 21 years old in late 1944 when he was pulled from his artillery battalion to join a new elite force of airmen. Japan was losing the war, and the kamikaze were an essential part of their last-ditch effort to turn the tide in their favor. Kamikaze missions were flying up until the very minute that the war ended on August 15, 1945. Young Horiyama was a devoted subject of his emperor, and he relished the opportunity to have his moment of glory in the name of his beloved country. Horiyama had completed his training and was preparing for his final glorious mission when the news came down that the Japanese had surrendered and the war was over. Though he was grateful that the emperor had ended the war, he was also regretful. "I felt bad that I hadn't been able to sacrifice myself for my country," he told reporters in 2015 at the age of 92.
That's crazy. Imagine being trained to die, fully prepared, and then history yanks the plug before you get your glorious exit. Horiyama spent decades carrying guilt for not dying, like survivor's remorse but weaponized by propaganda. It's wild. Peace saved him, yet the indoctrination made him feel cheated. That's the psychological hangover of total war, when living becomes the shame and dying was supposed to be the reward.
My comrades who had died would be remembered in infinite glory, but I had missed my chance to die in the same way. I felt like I had let everyone down. How were the Japanese able to convince so many young men in their prime, like Horiyama, to willingly and even enthusiastically give their lives for their country in these suicide missions? In short, they were trained to die. An excerpt from the Kamikaze training manual illustrates just how thoroughly these young men were indoctrinated. It reads, "When you eliminate all thoughts about life and death, you will be able to totally disregard your earthly life. This will also enable you to concentrate your attention on eradicating the enemy with unwavering determination, meanwhile reinforcing your excellence in flight skills." Honor is an extremely important part of Japanese culture, and kamikaze training focused on reinforcing this ideology and convincing these young men that their sacrifice would bring glory to them in the afterlife and honor to their families who they were leaving behind. Most believed that Emperor Hirohito and the nation of Japan were one and the same, and they were conditioned to be willing to die for him. They were trained to suppress all emotions and made to believe that they had been specially chosen for this sacrifice, a great honor in Japanese culture. In some cases, Emperor Hirohito himself would visit the kamikaze training school, attending their graduation ceremonies on a symbolic white horse, and personally requesting their services as kamikaze pilots. During their training, the pilots would practice the daring moves that would be required to complete their missions, repeatedly flying their planes almost vertically toward the ground to simulate crashing into an enemy target, before sharply reversing course just before crashing. These exercises prepared them for the day when they would follow through on their dive and plummet to glory and certain death.
That's even more crazy. One wrong move and you died with no reason. Training basically turned near death into a daily drill. Crash simulations as a warm-up for actual crashing. It's like practicing self-destruct as a skill set. Add Hirohito showing up on a white horse, and the whole thing feels like a bizarre mix of military boot camp and myth-building pageant.
Their intense training was incredibly effective in convincing thousands of young Japanese men to sacrifice their lives for their country and die for a worthy cause. By the end of World War II, at least 2,500 pilots had given their lives in kamikaze missions. Many history books put the number closer to 4,000. At the end of their training, kamikaze pilots were given a slip of paper with 3 options on it. They could either volunteer passionately, simply agree to volunteer, or they could refuse. In theory, anyway. Many survivors claim that those who refused were simply told to try again and to pick the right answer next time. By the end of the war, the Japanese were desperate for troops. Up until that point, university students had been exempt from military service, but by 1944, many young scholars, like Takehiko Ina, found themselves drafted into Japan's new elite force of kamikaze pilots. 20-year-old Ina had been studying economics at the prestigious Waseda University when he was pulled from school and thrust into kamikaze training. Japanese culture places a high value on the firstborn sons, and thus they were exempted from the ranks of kamikaze to protect their family lines. Ina, as a younger son, certainly had his reservations about his kamikaze mission, but he welcomed the opportunity to bring honor to his family on a level uncommon for younger sons.
That's wild. Signing a volunteer slip where refusing just meant try it again until you say yes. That's not volunteering, that's gaslighting with paperwork. And pulling university students like Ina into the program, it shows how desperate Japan was, draining brains for bodies. The firstborn exemption is fascinating too, basically sacrificing your spare sons for national honor. Imagine studying economics 1 week, then rehearsing your own death dive the next. It's patriotism mixed with bureaucracy, turned lethal.
Ina completed his training, volunteered to give his life for his country, and prepared to die. But fate had other plans for him. By the late stages of the war, the depleted Japanese were not only lacking troops, but were using out-of-date and damaged aircraft that had been stripped down and adapted for kamikaze missions. These aging planes would turn out to be Ina's salvation. On his first attempt, his plane failed to take off, and Ina's suicide mission was over before it had even begun. His second attempt made it off the ground, but engine troubles forced him to make an emergency landing before he got anywhere close to his target. During his third and final attempt, more engine troubles forced him to land in the sea, and Ina and his 2 crew members had to swim to a nearby island where they were stranded for 2.5 months. By the time they were rescued, the war was over, and Ina would never again have to prepare for certain death. Though the kamikaze trained to die, not all of them did. Those who returned fell into one of 2 groups: those who were forced to abort their missions due to mechanical troubles, weather, or failure to locate targets, and those who were unable to go through with their mission out of fear. The 2 groups were treated very differently by their superiors. Those like Ina, who were able to prove that they had returned for reasons beyond their control, were not punished. The Japanese could not afford to lose any pilots, so these kamikaze simply prepared to try again. Those who had backed out, though, were shamed and punished physically and mentally. Still, the depleted Japanese could not afford to lose even these reticent pilots, and the punishment was limited to ensure that the pilot could make another attempt. Even under these extraordinary circumstances, though, the Japanese military's tolerance had its limits. Surviving kamikaze pilots recall the fate of one pilot who returned from a total of 9 final flights, each time unable to go through with his mission. After his 9th attempt, he was finally executed for cowardice.
Ina basically survived because his planes were too broken to kill him. Like, fate patched his save file 3 times in a row. It's darkly ironic. Japan's failing industry accidentally spared him, stranded on an island instead of splattered on a battleship. That's a plot twist, but the contrast is brutal. Abort due to engine failure, you're fine. Abort due to fear, you're beaten, or worse. 9 final flights ending in execution feels like a grim parody of retrying a video game level until the system deletes your character.
To combat this natural tendency to pull out at the last minute, the Japanese implemented a number of strategies designed to encourage pilots to go through with their deadly mission. Pilots flew in a squadron in the hopes that peer pressure would ensure pilots followed through with their mission, and kamikaze were even given some liquid courage prior to takeoff to help them ease their doubts. Some say that the planes were loaded with only enough fuel for a one-way trip to ensure there was no hope of returning, and each pilot was made to compose a will and a letter to their families prior to their last flight. The Japanese kamikaze pilots of World War II went down in history as the fanatical and deranged samurai of the skies, committed to dying for the honor of their emperor and country, and willing to give their lives for glory. In reality, though, they were not given any real choice in the matter, with most agreeing to volunteer at the risk of dishonoring their families and being sent to die in dishonor anyways on the front lines of battle. In a desperate last-ditch bid to turn the war back in their favor, the Japanese sent thousands of young men in their prime to die on suicidal kamikaze missions. Despite this, few kamikaze did return from their missions and lived to tell their stories. Thanks to them, we know that the kamikaze were not all fanatical or deranged, but instead were desperate and afraid of dishonoring their families if a kamikaze survived. If you thought this video was fascinating, be sure to check out our other videos, like this one called The Horrors of Unit 731, to learn more about Japan's role in World War II. Or perhaps you'll like this other video instead. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.
What's striking is how much of the kamikaze myth was just smoke and mirrors. History painted them as fearless warriors, but in truth, they were mostly scared kids cornered by propaganda, peer pressure, and a system that punished survival. The real tragedy? Thousands of brilliant futures, engineers, poets, economists burned up in desperation dives that never had a chance of changing the war's outcome. Infographics Show did an amazing job with this video. The link's in the description if you want the full story. And next time, let's just say things get even stranger. Stay nerdy.